Nothing contained in this podcast should be considered a substitute for professional medical advice. This content does not represent our respective employers and is purely the opinion of the podcast hosts. We are not your personal medical providers. Sorry, friends. So, if you have concerns or are seeking a diagnosis or treatment, please seek individual advice from a healthcare provider in your area. We are not liable for any risks associated with acting upon the information contained in this podcast. This is intended for educational and entertainment purposes only, so enjoy the ride.
Please drink responsibly and in moderation. Before drinking, please be sure to be of the legal drinking age for your country. We do not encourage the misuse of alcohol.
Welcome to Medical Media Mixer, the perfect cocktail. I'm Nicole Peniston, psychologist.
And I'm Tara Prisco, physician assistant. All right, we are batch recording for the new year.
We are getting lots of stuff done today. What I did decide to do yesterday, instead of doing work that I should have, I did work, but I was like, well, I want to watch the newest / last season of Stranger Things, but I don't remember. So I went back and started watching everything. So I watched seasons 1 and 2 yesterday, and I just finished season 3 before we started recording. So
okay, yeah, I got to watch the newest season. The last episode just came out on New Year's Eve, right?
Yep.
No, the husband and I need to sit down. I told you we're watching Pluribus. We have one more episode of that. So we will watch that. That could have some sort of a psychological tie-in.
I'm sure it does. I'm not caught up. I think I'm like 3 episodes behind now because it's been a while since I started it.
And you know what I just watched? Wait, what did I watch? And I was like, what is it called? Hold on.
It's called a show that you're watching.
I literally binged it when I didn't feel good the other day. Oh, Wayward.
With Toni Collette. Yes.
Did you watch?
I've been seeing that.
So,
because I love Toni Collette. So,
but the thing about like those reform schools,
that's a whole thing.
That's a whole thing. That was like cult plus reform schools sort of mixed together, that show. Yeah. But I don't know, a tie-in with reform schools, because that was
well. And I watched Paris Hilton's documentary on her experience in the schools in Provo, which she's not alone in that. So that could be something covered in the future. Yeah,
and there was some documentary I'd watched also on like some of these more intense ones. It was like one in upstate New York, I think.
It's on Netflix. I also watched that one. So yeah, maybe we could do like a culmination episode of all that stuff.
Yeah, because there's some crazy stuff with that, like cuckoo. Oh my goodness.
Throw it up, put it on the list.
I know. I have my list on my phone. I have to add it to our list on the
Yes, I have stuff on my phone too that I haven't put on the big list, so I'll have to do that.
Yeah, I've been trying to soak in as many ideas as possible, but then I get so far ahead of myself that I forget by the time I get there. I'm like, what did I write here? What was I thinking?
Well, I think it's the first 3. No, the first 2 of my the first 3 of my first 4 episodes for this year are about books, because I was like, I barely did any books last year.
Right.
I've got some books I already read. I have some books that I read in preparation. So I was like trying to do more books. I literally just do not have the time for it. And it's been very hard. So there's one more book that I'm in the middle of, and it's going to be a struggle to finish it on time for when I want to record it, but I will do my very best. If not, I'll just cover what I did read.
Okay. Right. Exactly. One of the ones I have on here, I read the book, but there's a TV series coming out. So it depends.
Yes, I saw that note.
It depends if they drop the whole series or they do it like weekly, where I'll place it, because I want to watch that and then also talk about the book, because I'm curious if they take a more modern take, because the books were in the early 90s and there's some definitely cringy things in there.
Yeah.
We'll get to at that time. So like I said, I'm curious if the show does a more modern take or if it really does act like it's back in the early 90s.
Either way, there's something to be said for it.
Oh, yeah. But you'll see when I get into some of this stuff.
Yeah.
So that's that one. I'm looking back. We got a lot coming.
We do.
I finally put Chernobyl on the list.
I saw. We've been teasing Chernobyl for literally like 6 to 8 months.
Oh, my God. Did you see? I put for episode 61. That was just a random thought popped into my head. You have to see what it is. It's a song.
I did not, but now I'm going to go
Just
look.
be ready, people. There's just some random stuff that popped into my head, and I was like, ooh.
Oh, yeah. I like kind of skimmed over that. I was like, I don't know, but okay, that's your episode. I'll listen. I'll react. I didn't want to read too much because I want it to be like genuine when you're covering it.
Exactly.
So, but I was
exactly.
like, huh? Okay.
Yeah, we got a lot. We got a lot coming. All right. So what are we doing today? What are we drinking today? What are we doing today?
So today, the name of my cocktail is actually not a spoiler, which is a record for me because most of mine are pretty direct in what I'm talking about. And my next one will not be as vague as this one. But the name of my cocktail is called the Quad. It is 1.5 ounces of orange vodka. This calls for Kettle One. I think I had Smirnoff. I just used, whatever orange vodka I could find. 2/3 of an ounce of Cointreau or other triple sec liqueur. 1/4 of an ounce of Italian red bitter liqueur. I use Campari, but you can use, anything similar to that. And then it says 5/6 of an ounce of orange juice.
5/6.
Girl, I don't have time to freshly squeeze 5/6 of an ounce.
It's essentially almost the top.
A splash. Yeah.
Well, 5, 6, yeah.
And then what worked in my favor was I was using, bottled orange juice. And then when I opened my shaker, I spilled about 1/4 of my drink.
Oh,
so
nice.
I just added more orange juice to it.
There you go. No worries.
So it looks very pretty. It's a very orangey hue, if you can see it here. Got it in my coupe glass. And basically you toss all those ingredients into a shaker with ice, shake until chilled, strain into the coupe glass. You're supposed to put an orange twist. I don't have one. Ain't nobody got time for that. It's okay. You can make it pretty with an orange twist. If not, it's still going to taste the same. So
I need to get some of those dried citrus things.
And it's funny you say that because I do have dried orange downstairs and I totally forgot about it until you just said it.
Yeah, I could just pick that up just to have as cute little things to throw in. I have cherries in my one. I'm still drinking my one from last year. So
from last year or from last episode?
Episode from last year. No, not last year.
Still drinking a cocktail from last year. It is January 2nd, just in case anyone's wondering. She's still sipping on a cocktail from 2025.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. So as I said, my cocktail is called the Quad, and I took a sip. That was my pause. I'm going to be talking about a book today that I don't know how it popped up on my Amazon, but it did very randomly. I was not at all searching for books. But the title of the book is called Girls and Their Monsters, The Ghanaian Quadruplets and the Making of Madness in America. So that title alone, I was like, I need to read this, WTF. And then it probably was in my Amazon list or cart for quite some time before I actually did purchase it. But then I bought it a couple months ago, bought it back in September and read it. And I was like, I'm going to cover this on the podcast because it is fascinating. So first we'll go into summarizing the book and then we'll kind of talk more about the psychological aspects of it. But the story kind of goes back and forth in time. It starts off in 1954, where the newly created National Institute of Mental Health under the National Institute of,
Health? There is NIH.
Yes, NIH. So NIH decided they were going to create a subsection, NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health. And it was kind of this whole experimental thing. And the whole reason it came up was that was at the time in medical society where psychiatry was really trying to forge its own separate field. And so they're like, okay, we'll make you a whole separate institute. If you feel like you got all this information that you need to talk about, fine, here's your own little area of study to work on.
Okay.
And so they were studying a lot of different things that were out there at the time in the 50s. Schizophrenia we knew about. We didn't really know as much about bipolar. And quite frankly, and it does go into detail in the book, at that time they were slapping the term schizophrenia on any sort of mental illness.
Right.
Trauma, dissociative disorders, severe anxiety, depression, bipolar, everything was getting labeled schizophrenia. And so the point of the National Institute of Mental Health was really to kind of drill down what schizophrenia is, how it differentiates from these other disorders, so that way we can guide better treatments. Of course, they were doing other studies on other disorders as well, but that was kind of their big hallmark study. And so when they were doing this, they had gotten a letter from someone, and it's not 100% clear how the connections were made, but essentially some psychiatrist/doctor heard about these quadruplets who all were diagnosed with schizophrenia. And then NIMH was like, well, get them girls in here because we need to figure out what's going on, because also at this time, it was a huge debate on nature versus nurture. And so they're like, well, if we can study this and drill down to the genetics of it, then we can essentially, and I know this is not appropriate, we can kind of genetically breed out schizophrenia. If we can isolate the genes, we can get rid of it. Now, in retrospect, the 1950s was not our greatest time in America, despite some things you've been told, at least not our greatest time in terms of understanding mental health, understanding health, being appropriate. And so a lot of stuff, really, really fascinating stuff comes up in this book about the context of what was going on in the 50s and the 60s, and then later on in the 70s, what was going on for these girls, how women and girls in general were treated regarding mental health, and then what the difference is between genetics, mental health, and trauma. So, and it gets very confusing because these are 4 identical girls, and it was a natural conception.
Wow.
So, yes.
Yeah, they're identical, so it'd have to be.
Yeah. So at this time, they were one of the very, very few surviving quadruplets ever. Prior to them, there was another set of, I want to say it was quintuplets. I want to say there were 5 of them. Quints are 5, right? Yes. 5. I believe they were in Canada, and it was such a sensation that the government actually built them their own house and had like individual nannies for them. And it was just like this craze of like, wow, we've got 5 babies. Like, let's celebrate them. And something similar happened with the Ghanaian quadruplets. I'll get into their individual names and all that stuff in a minute. But because it was happening in the US and it was happening in Michigan, they didn't necessarily have as much money and attention. As much money to give that sort of attention, but they definitely got press for it. It was also, the mother did not know she was having quadruplets. And so it was an even bigger kind of splash.
They didn't have ultrasound back then. And
exactly.
So just what they could feel and hear, like that was it.
Exactly. And so the mother, at some point during the pregnancy, she had been trained as a nurse prior to her pregnancy, and she was quite young. I want to say she was like 23, 24. And so she kind of instinctively knew something was not right with her pregnancy, but was continually dismissed, as, that comes to be a trend in the book about how women and girls at that time were highly dismissed for any concerns about their own health, especially gynecological health.
Right.
And so this mother right away was like, something's not right. Like it feels like there's weird movements. I like feel way sicker than I should. And they were just like, literally there's a quote where a doctor basically told her to shut up and go home and be happy that she was having a baby.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right.
So real intense there about that. So she gives birth. There are 4 babies. Right away, her husband's like, what the fuck? I wanted 1 boy. You gave me 4 girls. Again, this is the 50s. People could get away with that shit then. They can't now. But from the start, he was very disappointed with this, felt like it was a burden, because now not only did he have to care for his wife, he had to care for 4 children, not just 1, which that's going to be difficult for any family, especially unexpected in this way that it was.
The financial burden. I mean,
yes.
Geez.
And, they were a lower middle class family. So it's not like they had a ton of money that they could kind of pivot and make it work. They were really struggling. And so in that way, the news media attention to these 4 girls kind of benefited them, because they would start asking for donations for people to come see the girls. And so it sounds a little bit like they're pimping out their kids. I don't think it wasn't necessarily that gross of an intention, but it was like, how are we going to pay for these 4 babies? Everybody wants to see them. Hey, let's charge money for people to, come and take pictures of them, or to interview the mom, or, and this was like newspapers, like city councilmen, like everybody wanted to see these 4 girls.
Yeah.
So right from the start, literally right out the box, they were a sensation for everyone. And the family was really struggling. And so to their credits, ? They were pretty attractive little babies and little girls. So that also helped, because everybody loves a cute baby.
Of course.
I'm just going to leave it at that. We just know not every baby's a cute baby. And these were cute babies. And so very, very early on, their mother essentially kind of turned them into the Von Trapp family singers. And they had like a little singing entertainment group.
Oh my goodness.
And when I say very early on, I mean like by 2 and 3.
They were traveling the
This is
country.
like Gypsy Rose.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. So very, very young, basically from the time that, they could speak and learn basic things. They were taught songs and singing and little dance routines and would all have little matching outfits. And they'd already been such a sensation that, of course, now when they're traveling, people are going to go and pay money to go see them. But these are still little girls. And for context, maybe you can speak to this, when you have identical quadruplets, what is the likelihood that all four of them are very healthy?
Right. Oh, well, no.
Especially without the appropriate prenatal care, knowing that there were quads, back in the 50s.
Yeah, they're going to be underweight for sure, but the risk also after birth of brain bleeds and, cerebral palsy and lung issues and all of that. And usually their birth weights, a combined birth weight, isn't going to be that much. So they're all going to be 2-3 pounds when they're born, probably less than 4.
Yeah. And so I don't have all of those exact statistics. It's definitely in the book, but I do know that of the 4 girls, there was definitely one who was a bit smaller, a bit slower cognitively, just couldn't really keep up with the others. And then, of course, when they're doing that comparison, there was one who was like the star child, who was perfect in everything, and who was the best, and who was the smartest, and who was the healthiest. And so very, very early on, there became this comparison and essentially this competition between the girls as well. They kind of allude to them splitting off to, the 2 better ones and the 2 lesser ones, and the 2 of them kind of sticking together, but also very early on. And again, this was a different time, a different place. People didn't know differently. They were collectively called the girls. Now, they did have individual names, but they kind of all assumed one identity, one united identity, which is going to be very difficult later on in life when you need to differentiate because you have to, because now you're older and you want to get married or you want to, go get jobs, not knowing how to be your own individual person. From the start, they really didn't have that differentiation. Right. Which again, at that time, we didn't necessarily know that. And I believe at one point, even one doctor kind of advises that they let them be kind of this unified unit because they'll always have each other. Which I feel like there's a whole different episode, a whole area of research that we could do about talking about twins and multiples and how it is a different psychology and a different life experience. But I think there's a lot of stuff that happens that didn't necessarily need to happen had they been able to be their own individual girls. But even from their given birth names, they're kind of like marketed, unfortunately. So the hospital that they were born in, each girl was named for one initial of the hospital. Because it was like a 4-named hospital or whatever. So they each had names for like all of those. So I'm trying to find their individual names. And it was very hard for me as I'm reading it because they're at the point where the book was written, and the research was being done, all 4 were alive. And then by the end of the book, only one of them is still surviving. So there's a lot of back and forth about one talking about the other or talking about their individual experiences versus shared experiences. So it can be kind of tricky to keep them separate. But I also feel like that was their experience where they weren't separated. So even though it was hard to understand, that was what their life was. So the Ghanaian quadruplets, that was actually a pseudonym. That was not their real name. Their birth last name was Morlock. But when they were given the pseudonym, as per the NIMH research, they were also given names that started with each letter of NIMH. So it was Nora, Iris, Myra, and Hester. I believe their real names were Sarah. It's hard to find them. It's listed in the book, but it's not necessarily like easy to find public information, but it is out there if you really search for it. Actually, I think I have. So one of the 4 sisters, I believe, Helen. So she is the oldest surviving. She passed in 2003, but she was the oldest surviving. She was the Guinness Book of World Records oldest surviving of an identical quadruplet at that time. So they performed tap dance and comedy routines in the 1930s and 1940s. Their real names were Edna, Wilma, Sarah, and Helen. And I forget the name of the hospital. But initially, for some time, they were known as baby A, B, C, and D. So, yeah. And they were in the Guinness Book of World Records for one of the earliest documented cases of naturally conceived identical quadruplets in the United States.
Yeah, it's still rare. Because
Yeah,
that's
it is.
literally
Yeah.
one embryo splitting into 4. That's extremely rare.
And it obviously at that time, there was no intention for that to happen through like IVF or things like that. It was just natural. So the Wilma died in 2022. Helen died in 2003 at the age of 73. Edna died in 2015 at the age of 84. And Sarah died on 2025 at the age of 95. So Sarah is the one who is basically kind of narrating the whole book at the end. And there have been multiple books written on them. One is called The Morlock Quadruplets, The Alphabet Sisters, because of what we just talked about. Mm-hmm. And there are several documented NIMH studies regarding them. So what I'm going to get into is, there's a lot of information here. I'm trying to like drill it down. My episode is not going to be as short as yours.
No, that's okay.
Yes. So the pseudonym Ghislaine derives from the Greek, meaning dire birth. Mm-hmm. So that's fun. They're really just giving them all the great names. So they became local celebrities. As I said, they had like an entertainment group. They all grew up with their parents in the same household, and their parents were described as disturbed in the NIMH studies. The book gives a little bit more context for that. So the father is assumed, although not formally diagnosed, but assumed to have schizophrenia. He had multiple violent outbursts throughout his life. Definitely had some fringe, and this is for the 50s. So for him to have fringe racial ideas in the 50s means it was real special.
It was
back
real,
then.
real extra.
And so, and it was alluded that his mother, the father's mother, also had some mental health issues of her own. So definitely there was some sort of genetic basis. NIMH was not just like making this up because it was 4 girls diagnosed. There was some family history as well. And the grandmother had paranoid schizophrenic symptoms, again, not formally diagnosed. And their father was also physically and sexually abusive, which they did not find out until much later in the research. And this is where it gets a little tricky, because when NIMH researchers started to catch on to this, they didn't do anything about it. They just kind of documented it. Now, at this point, all of the girls were adults legally, but their parents were still coming and visiting them, and the father was still physically abusive. There were some allusions to potential sexual abuse while the girls were at NIMH, because they did reside there for several years.
Right.
The father oftentimes would be abusive to staff and scare them. There were certain staff that refused to go see the girls when the father was physically present. The mother was... It kind of goes back and forth, because sometimes they say that she was absent and cold and attention seeking for herself. And then at other times they kind of paint her as a victim of just trying to do her best for her girls and not knowing how to protect herself. So it's a little less disparaging to the mother, which honestly for the 50s, that's surprising. But I think it's because of the level of abuse that the father did not keep secret. Like, he would openly say and do things about it. And no one kind of did anything. And just to paint a little picture of the father, at one point he ran for sheriff of the town, and he used pictures of the baby girls as like his advertising.
Of course. And
that was how he won. And he did win. And then he basically just collected a pension and did nothing except for carry a gun and scare people.
Okay.
Yeah. So
a sheriff with schizophrenia himself, who's abusive to his children.
Yeah. And everybody knew, and nobody really said anything. Yeah.
Nice.
So as I said, there were the 4 girls, Myra and Nora. These are their pseudonyms, but this is as per the NIMH study, so I'll use their pseudonyms. Myra and Nora were the more favorably treated by their parents, but they were also abused in many ways, but less so than the 2 younger girls, Iris and Hester. And Hester was considered to be a habitual masturbator, a moron type, and a sex maniac.
A moron type.
This is the 50s. Let's keep it. What I think they would say today is she probably had an intellectual disability.
Right.
Because they definitely said in school she was much, much slower than her sisters, really struggled. And for multiple years, they actually kept all the girls back in school until Hester could keep up. And then they finally realized she's not catching up. And so that was when they finally separated. But I think it was 4 years they kept the girls back to repeat grades so they could all stay together. And then this part, so trigger warnings, there's a lot of difficult things in this story. And one of them is the following. So if you don't want to hear it, fast forward about 30 seconds. Iris and Hester were were circumcised, female circumcision, to prevent them from masturbating. And this was, I want to say, about the age 8 or 9.
Oh.
Yes.
Ow.
For context, it is common and appropriate for young children to explore their own sexuality in that way. To be doing it chronically can be a sign of abuse or other concerns. Because we now know in retrospect that Hester had intellectual disability, this may have just been a difficult compulsion for her to manage. But
Right.
it's not necessarily something that could or should be addressed by masturbation, because they continue to masturbate despite that. So that's a trigger warning for that one. As I said, they were physically abused. And then at, I want to say it's the age of 22, they were all pretty severely disabled. Each of them at some points had tried to work, had tried to be somewhat independent, had tried to date. And by this point, they were all home-ridden, not necessarily bedridden. Hester, the youngest, had become nonverbal and regressed significantly. Helen, if I'm getting them correctly, because I know I keep switching back and forth the names, basically one was essentially nonverbal completely. The older would take care of the younger 3, but she would then have crying spells and hallucinations, and they all had serious mental health issues by the time they were in their 20s, and their parents were aging and had health issues of their own, so literally could no longer care for them. And so I believe it was a local doctor knew of their plight, kind of connected them to NIMH. And essentially I don't like the way that the book says this because it's not this simple and easy, but they essentially sold them to NIMH. That is not the case. They received very minimal money, but the girls were fully taken care of. They were housed, they were fed, they had all their mental and physical health treatment taken care of when they were at NIMH. So of all the sisters, all the 3 older sisters did graduate high school. Myra worked as a secretary for most of her life. She was one of the higher functioning girls. She did get married, had 2 sons, would often go and visit her sisters in mental health facilities. They were in various facilities after their MANH studies. Her oldest son contracted AIDS and died, and her younger son maintained a close relationship with his mother and his aunts. One of the other sisters, Nora, managed the income of all of the sisters basically for advertisement. They were still a sensation. So she would make sure that they got income from like their photographs being published in textbooks, or if NIMH published any other studies, that they got some money for that. So even though she had mental health issues of her own, she was at least trying to help out all of them. So that way they weren't fully taken advantage of by this situation. And then Iris was very briefly a beautician, but most of her adult life, she was institutionalized. So all 4 girls were diagnosed with schizophrenia by the age of 24. There was that history of mental health in the father's family. But also, I'm also just assuming that if the mother didn't have appropriate prenatal care, there definitely could have been some other issues going on that may have at least not set them up for genetic health moving forward.
Right, of course.
So NIMH did years-long study. Essentially, their goal was trying to clarify that schizophrenia was genetic. But at that time, in the 50s and the 60s, they didn't necessarily have that research to support it. So what they were essentially doing were exclusionary studies, where they would study families who had one or multiple members with schizophrenia and try to suss out, like, okay, what's this family line? Like, how does it connect? All of that other stuff. As time went on, they did a little bit more sophisticated research of people who were diagnosed with schizophrenia, but who were adopted. So we didn't know their genetic line, but trying to see, like, okay, was it more of that nurture? So was it their family that they were adopted by? Was it the environment that they were in? And despite all of this really interesting and thoughtful research they did, they weren't necessarily able to drill it down. They were able to find some genetic tendencies towards schizophrenia, but they couldn't isolate it to specific genes that were causing it. They couldn't isolate it to specific family members, so it's not necessarily genetically loaded on like an X or Y chromosome. And so even though they were finding some of that foundation that there is a genetic basis, essentially what they came to say, not so publicly because they didn't want to, because it wasn't their goal, was that there's multiple factors that can cause schizophrenia.
Right.
And so as we know it currently, that people can have a disposition, but depending on lots of other factors in your life, including environment, it may or may not be expressed.
Right. So there's another, I'm sure you've probably read the book Hidden Valley Road. Have you?
I watched the series. I did not read the book.
Okay. Yeah. So I read the book. I don't think I watched the series. I should. But that's, I mean, a similar circumstance. They had 12 children and
Yes.
6 had schizophrenia. And that, I think they were born in the late 40s and then into the 50s. And in the 70s is really when the research started for them.
Yes. Yeah.
But it was also showing it was a mixture of that genetic link, but there was also a lot of
family trauma. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's essentially what comes up. Some other really interesting things that come up in the book that, if I'm being 100% honest, were very uncomfortable to read, but I also think it gives you context and understanding of what was going on. At the time where they were traveling and performing, one of the most popular performers was Shirley Temple.
Oh, yeah.
And with the lens that we have now in 2026, looking back, Shirley Temple was a highly sexualized little girl. Very short skirts. Every film that she was in, it was a little bit of flirtation. It was always with older men. Sometimes it was with African-American men. And at that time, unfortunately, in the 50s and the 60s, there was this idea that African-American men were sexual animals and very aggressive. And so now you're putting this on screen with a little white girl. What messages are we telling?
Yeah.
We know all those things are not true, but this is the context of what was going on in society at the time. So it kind of alludes to that it is highly likely that the girls were also, if not sexually abused when they were performing, were definitely sexually objectified.
Right, of course.
And so that's really uncomfortable to think about, but it is the reality of what was going on at the time. And so they're trying to use that as like part of the context, part of the trauma that they endured, shaping their later relationships, because 2 of the 4 girls had severe paranoia about men and sexuality. Now, we don't know if that's directly related to that or the abuse from their father or other things. On multiple occasions, many of the girls had either attempted or full sexual assaults by employers, by other men in the community, which unfortunately was something that happened at the time. So they were definitely not alone in that, but knowing that they already had some mental health issues going on definitely left them susceptible to that type of abuse. So that comes up in the book. There's also some really, really interesting research interesting allusions to the research and how it connects to racism and how there was a focus on, protecting white people and especially white women and white girls and preserving their health and their mental health. Right. And anyone who did not fall into that demographic was a savage, was crazy, was mentally ill, which I'll talk about in, a couple episodes. I'm reading a different book that looks at racism and mental health as well, back in the 50s and the 60s and earlier than that. But there's a lot of really intriguing things that come up in the book that talk about that type of stuff. But I think what the most interesting part of it is despite the trickiness of what went on, the Ghanaian quadruplets really were what kept the NIMH as an institution as we know it today. Huh. So at one point, briefly, NIMH was closed and then reopened. And there were some budgetary things. It was during one of the wars. So there were some financial things going on, but they did briefly close and then were reopened. So despite what went on, the research that these girls endured really did help establish mental health research and treatment as we know it today. And so you're probably saying, what kind of research did they do? A lot of it was just observation, watching them do cognitive tests and tracking their performance over years. There really was no change in IQ, which we know that tends to be what happens. Yeah, right. It's stable in your late teenage years, early 20s, and it really shouldn't change unless there's some sort of brain injury or major illness or things like that. There was a slight decline in IQ, which we can see in neurodegenerative disorders, which schizophrenia can cause degeneration in the brain, especially the ventricles enlargen over time. So then that's going to cause some damage and can cause some reduction in IQ. But this is also as they're aging. So there's also a somewhat of a drift as you get older as well. So, that research, even though they were tracking it, it's good to see, but it didn't really tell us something we didn't already know. It did give a lot of insight, though, into the role of trauma, into the role of societal trauma. So the way that they were objectified, the way that they felt that society felt like they owned them or were owed something by these girls, the way that National Institute of Mental Health felt like they owned them and were owed something by these girls, and how that took away their autonomy, their individuality. And if you don't have autonomy and individuality, what does that mean for your mental health? Who are you as a person? How do you know who you are? How do you know what's good? How do you know what's bad? How do you know if you're healthy or not? So a lot of really interesting questions came up in this book. So in the show notes, the book will be linked. And then there is a really interesting study from, what year is this? It's a literature review from 2021 about the genetics and environmental interactions in schizophrenia. So essentially, as I was saying, we know that it's not just one thing. People can have a genetic predisposition, but for that disposition to be expressed, several things have to fall into place for that. One of them is, and this is a little controversial, but it is true, substance abuse can trigger some of these things to be expressed later on. So you've probably heard about psychotic disorder from substance abuse that can, in certain people, that can turn into schizophrenia, depending on the type of substance use, the length of it, severity of it, all that stuff.
It's like a tipping point. It
exactly
pushes them over the edge of something they were already genetically susceptible to. Exactly.
Other things like certain types of brain infections, like certain types of toxoplasmosis, herpes, cytomegalovirus, rubella, other things like that can increase the risk of later tipping off that schizophrenia predisposition. So there's lots of things that can go on in the environment, in the genes. Trauma, as I was saying before, drug use, specifically cannabis, this study talks about, but I know other more intense drugs like psychedelics and things like that can also cause them as well. Then it also talks a little bit about, do you know what ACEs are?
I mean, as a medication, not as a...
No. So ACEs are adverse childhood experiences. And there's been a lot of research on that. So those can also set the stage for later mental health issues, especially schizophrenia. So some common ACEs are poverty, sexual abuse, physical abuse, exposure to toxins, financial instability, moving, things like that a lot of people experience. So not everyone is necessarily, who has experienced any one of those ACEs, not everyone is necessarily having mental health issues, but the more ACEs that you have, the more likely you are to have some sort of mental health issue in the future. And then if you already have that genetic predisposition, that's just going to give even more likelihood of that stuff to happen.
Got it.
So that's that interesting study. And then I linked a whole document about the National Institute of Mental Health because they just celebrated their 75 years of being in operation, I guess is the right way to call it. There's a lot of political and historical stuff in the book as well about why that came up, why things were reduced. Like we know, like during the Reagan administration, they did a lot of deinstitutionalization, which left a lot of people with mental health issues on the street. So it kind of goes back and forth about all of those political changes and how it impacted both the NIMH, but also research and availability of treatment. Also talks about privately funded versus publicly funded institutions and mental health clinics and how those changes occurred over time. So that booklet that I attached is pretty interesting because it goes into everything. It even goes into the civil rights movement in mental health, which I'll be talking about in the future on a future episode. So some really cool stuff on there. I will say, I'm sure they put all the fun, pretty stuff in this document, not some of the uglier stuff, but you know, both things can be true at once. You can have a lot of wonderful progress and also make mistakes over time.
Did the research in these girls do anything to differentiate how schizophrenia is presented in women versus men, and you know, anything into that? Because I know we were always taught it's more common in men, but it's obviously possible in both.
So they didn't fully go into those gender differences. I think at the time, if we're giving it context, I don't think they necessarily cared that women may present differently than men. Okay. And honestly, I think really their focus was on finding family members. So it was more about finding that genetic link versus differentiating the sexes. There was a whole controversy about, there was this research done, I want to say it was in Sweden, and then it was basically supporting what NIMH thought. But then when they re-looked at it, they found that they necessarily didn't read the research correctly, or they were kind of not necessarily skewing the numbers, but misinterpreting it. And that was looking at that, what I was talking about before, that link between families who had adopted a child who later developed schizophrenia versus the genetic predisposition. Basically, they were kind of over reading the genetic link and saying it was happening more often. That being said, we know there is a genetic link of some sort. So it is going to happen more often than in the families that had adopted. But they were saying it was happening, and I'm just making this number up off the top of my head because I don't have it in front of me. But let's say they were saying it was happening in 30% of cases when it's actually happening in maybe 5% of cases. So they were kind of inflating those numbers. And then the final thing that I linked in the show notes, because they only touch on it in the book, and I've heard about it multiple times before, but I don't know if other people have. Have you heard about the Hearing Voices Network?
No.
So the Hearing Voices Network is a collective of people who believe that hearing voices, seeing visions, or having other unusual perceptions is not a mental health disorder.
Okay.
And there are actually some celebrities who have been associated with the Hearing Voices Network. I did have a list. I can't find them, but I'm sure they're on their website, because multiple people have had these perceptual experiences, but have had no other mental health challenges. And so they're basically trying to establish that we're labeling too many people as having schizophrenia. But if we're truly following the DSM-5 criteria, it's not just hallucinations, delusions, all those sorts of things.
Impact their functioning, their
Exactly.
life.
It has to cause significant impairment in social, occupational, personal functioning. And so I think the way that the people in the Hearing Voices Network are talking about is that they're not impacted to that degree. So I think then that is a separate experience.
Is this something that falls into sort of parapsychology and the unknown and psychics and all that stuff?
Sort of, but not really. So what they're talking about, people are saying, I'm seeing and hearing things that aren't there. And they're unusual sensory experiences. Okay. But they're not necessarily saying where they're coming from. And so I think there's probably a split in that community of, it's, parapsychology, it's, supernatural, there's probably a split in where it's coming from. They're basically just saying that they want to create a respectful and empowering space for people who have these unusual sensory experiences and to take the stigma out of it. Okay. And so on their website, it says statistics vary, but somewhere between 3 to 10% of the population have experiences, increasing to about 75% if you include one-off experiences. And the example they give, as a psychologist, makes me cringe a little, but I'm just reading what they say. It says, hearing someone call your name out loud. Okay. Every single person I know has heard their name called out loud, and it has not occurred.
So there's this phenomenon that most parents...
Which you were going to talk about, yes.
Well, I don't know if you're going to talk about it's the same thing that I'm thinking. That parents, especially when you have a newborn... You hear the baby crying and they're not. And you're in the shower, specifically, because it's like the one moment you're not in the room with the child, you hear the baby crying. Yeah. It is like... it's a weird thing, and most parents can say they've heard it.
Yeah. And so there are these experiences. The hearing your name called is a very, very common one, wherein basically it's a little bit like the best example I can think of for, lay people to understand is it's a little bit like deja vu, where it's kind of a feedback loop where you're hearing something, and it's always something very familiar and very personal. So like hearing a baby crying when you have a young child, hearing your name being called, things like that, hearing your name being called. And it's always, at least from what I've heard, it's always a familiar voice.
Right.
The experience of schizophrenia is typically not that, like, in both of those situations, like your name being called or hearing a baby crying, it's not scary to the point, it's not malicious.
Right. How about, like, is there a phenomenon of having a different voice being your, like, narrator in your head? Like,
so that's more associated with some types of schizophrenia because they feel like they're not connected to that narrator. But hearing a voice in your head, if it feels familiar, it's your own thoughts.
Right.
But not everyone's thoughts are associated with sound.
Right.
Which for people who their thoughts are associated with sound, that sounds so foreign, but it's just different ways. Like
mine are
it's very common for folks on the spectrum for their thoughts to be associated with images.
Mine, I have their words without, I don't know, my thoughts. I don't say
words without hearing it. Yeah.
Right. And I don't have images or sounds. It just is.
Yeah.
I don't know.
But I'm sure that there's been times where maybe you've had a rehearsal of a conversation in your head, or you've rerun something. So then that's more of a verbal, but not actual words.
Right.
I think that's the other thing too, with any of these experiences, whether they're psychotic, schizophrenic, or normal, your own experience in your own head, no one else can tell you what that is like.
No.
Because everyone's own experience in their own head is very individualized. So the way that we're able to diagnose things is when it's causing significant impairment, fear, mistrust, when it's causing problems for people.
Right.
That's the difference between these more general experiences and what would rise to the level of a diagnosis.
Okay.
Because I've met people who have schizophrenia who maybe, you know, they have a religious delusion or they're having religious hallucinations. But even though that may be comforting to them, they've said sometimes it's too much and it's overwhelming. So it's that tipping point that is the diagnosis worthy.
Okay.
Yeah. So Hearing Voices Network, HVN, very interesting. There's some cool information on there. My personal opinion is still kind of question mark about it because I'm also not the type of person or type of psychologist who feels like I could possibly know everything there is to know in the world. I'm never going to say that.
Right.
I'm not ever going to disparage someone else's experience, but I will say whether I understand it or not. And this hearing voices thing, I don't fully grasp. Doesn't mean that I won't eventually grasp it, but from the way that they're describing it, it feels like it's more of that gray area that can kind of be like a common human experience versus
right. I mean, if it's not
something special.
causing distress, it's not then a pathology, and it does not necessarily need to be treated with medications. And bottom line, like if it's not causing distress, whatever. You know?
Well, and I think that's the tricky part about it, because a lot of people who are experiencing true schizophrenia type symptoms, they may be concealing those symptoms. So we're not necessarily understanding their level of distress until there is some sort of crisis that happens.
Right.
But typically those people who, you know, TV worthy schizophrenia, they're not taking care of their hygiene or their diet. You know, they're not able to work. They're not able to take care of themselves. They're not able to function in society. And so that is a serious impairment where regardless of what their beliefs are, other people can see that impairment is harmful for them.
Right.
And that's taking out any judgments about what those hallucinations, delusions are about. But it can be tricky, you know, and I think I always try to approach people in as much of a non-judgmental manner as possible. But, you know, if someone's harming themselves because their hallucination is telling them to cut their wrists, that's a safety concern for me. And that's how I would approach that person. Say, I'm worried about your safety. And I don't know who is telling you to do this or if it's your own choice, but we want to get you safe first. And then we can figure out the rest.
Right.
And I don't know if necessarily a lot of professionals in the field start with that empathy or that safety concern. And so that's why a lot of people who have those experiences don't trust medical professionals and don't trust psychiatric facilities, especially.
Definitely. There's so much more on schizophrenia, and I'm sure it's going to come up in so many different things. So this is like one, you know, version of it, talking about just the research that led to things. But I think it's such an interesting thing. The mind is amazing, and it can create all kinds of things in positive ways and not so positive ways, you know, but
yes.
It's interesting.
I just found the famous people. I knew there was one that like you would know. Anthony Hopkins says that he is part of the Hearing Voices Network.
Is he?
Yes.
He's also like a serial killer as an actor. So
I was going to say, he's not an actual serial killer. He just plays a really good one.
I mean, I'm not sure.
Look, Sir Hopkins is going to come after you now that you've put that out there. And, you know, if somebody's going to come after you, it might as well be someone who's been knighted. So.
Yeah, exactly.
But then it's kind of tricky because on this other list of famous people, they have John Nash, who there's a whole movie about his schizophrenia.
Right,
and he's come out and talked. He came out and talked about it before he passed. So it's like, what is going on here? Like,
right.
And you know what? Maybe that's just how he owns it. He decided to testify to this and then was like, nope, it's schizophrenia. So it's kind of hard. But a lot of the other people who are listed here as famous people didn't necessarily have a level of, like Anthony Hopkins, to our knowledge, he hasn't had any severe, significant hospitalizations or, you know, functional problems. But I mean, he's Anthony Hopkins. He could have hid that. I don't know.
Right.
So interesting stuff, something to think about. I always, like I said, I don't want to disparage someone's experience. So I like to look at both sides of what the experience is. But for the Morlock/Ghanaian girls, they definitely had a lot of difficult times in their life. And Helen especially did her best to live her life to the fullest and really contributed to this book. And there's actually not the foreword, the afterword. whatever comes at the end of the book. It's basically
prologue
like
and the epilogue.
Yes, the epilogue. The author talking about how she connected with her and how they would just have these really nice times where they would just sit together and drink tea, and it brought that human side of it to it. That despite all these terrible things that went on, that these are people
just
and they had just a person and had really lovely qualities too, despite the difficult things that they'd experienced. So that was what I'm covering today, and I talked a lot more than you did.
That's okay. That's good. Fill it up. I mean, it's interesting how, we look back now historically at the way we research things and the way we handled things. I guess you have to think of it as this is all we knew at the time.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's like, ooh.
Yeah. Well, and I would be remiss. I didn't talk too much about one of the head researchers, and I'm blanking on his name, so I'm a bad person, but they did say that he truly did care for these girls and their family. And even after he ended up having to retire early due to what they believe was Alzheimer's. He was in denial about it. But, he would go and visit their parents and go and visit them when they were living out in the community and really did truly care about them to the point where his children essentially were raised like knowing that these women were kind of part of the family, even though they weren't related. And so really positive things, it wasn't all these terrible monsters in white coats, sedating people all the time. There were several people who truly did care about these women and their family and their health and did their best to help them. So there were good sides of it as well. Yeah.
All right. Good stuff.
Yes.
All right. So thank you for listening to Medical Media Mixer.
The perfect cocktail. Cheers. Here's my drink.
I got nothing but
left. Nothing but juice.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of the Medical Media Mixer podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, don't forget to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Your support helps others find the show. Want to keep the conversation going? Follow us on social media. We're at Medical Media Mixer Podcast on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and on Pinterest, the Medical Media Mixer board.
If you'd like to support the show and help us grow, check us out on Patreon. Patreon.com/Medical Media Mixer Podcast. And on Buy Me a Coffee, buymeacoffee.com/Medical Media Mixer Podcast. If you have a topic idea, feedback, or just want to say hi, send us an email at medicalmediamixer@gmail.com. You can also stream all of our episodes and find more info on our website, medicalmediamixer.podbean.com. We're available on all major podcast platforms, so no matter where you listen, we're there. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, keep mixing medicine and media.